Okay, so I actually have a question about getting the Overwatch League slot for Los Angeles.
Sure.
And I realize, obviously, there are going to be NDAs surrounding some of these things, and some of these numbers haven't been made public, so I have to assume there's a reason for that, you know? I mean, I'd love it in the ideal world where everyone's bragging about being a sport. Well, you know, in sports, they tend to love to tell people how much things cost and how players cost a certain amount of money and a team costs a certain amount of money.
It's very rare that you actually get that level of transparency by design in professional sports.
It gets out there somehow, though, mate.
That's true.
And there's another thing, by the way, just as a little tip for people listening to the interview. Journalists aren't as good as some of them try to make out. Like, they can't just get all pieces of information, because if you think this wouldn't have been a blockbuster story if they could all have revealed the exact amounts that everyone paid, that would definitely be out there if they could. Part of it is some people do have connections in the industry who want that information to be out there, perhaps about rivals and so on. So I think it's very convenient that all the ranks sort of got closed on that one, and there hasn't been as much transparency as you're alluding to here. So the question, though, is, one of the things that kind of frustrates me a bit is it is constantly implied that actually we don't need to know the numbers, Noah. Everyone paid the same amount, and to know how much the buy-ins for the league were, you take 12, you times it by a certain number, and you end up with a very nice round number. And so no problem, everyone paid the same. But here's the part I don't understand.
Sure.
The concept that was built for this league was geolocation. And so while, okay, I personally, wouldn't consider Boston like the best place in the US. Okay, I can understand why Robert Kraft might want that. Like, that has a logical, connection that goes beyond, again, the concept of big markets and so on. But people would think if it's going to be a geolocation model, somewhere like LA, somewhere like New York, these should be top of the list, because again, in the traditional sports model, I mean, to this day, this is how even player transfers and things often hinge on these factors. Are you going, like, it doesn't matter, if I could get slightly more to play in Milwaukee, I'm probably not going to take that if I can get similar money to play in Los Angeles for obvious reasons. So the part that doesn't make sense is, I get that part. I think that part actually makes sense. But how can it simultaneously be, like, essentially, is there any benefit to having a location, either for the league being able to sell the slot or for the person buying the slot? Was there specific competition for certain locations? If so, it's hard to understand where the value would come from, if not in the buy-in,
Yeah, I mean, I think we're very happy that we ended up in the Southern California market. We think we have a great market with a huge potential for building what we want to build. Of course, I'm not going to comment on how much we paid or how much anyone might have paid or the ratio between those. I guess what I would say is, from a philosophical perspective, I think everyone entering season 1 of Overwatch League was aligned that even if, Boston might be a small market and LA might be a big market, and who knows how big a market London is, that in the early days of the league, success was going to be relatively proportional to every team, right? Because it takes 2 years before you're really hitting a local market anyway. And everyone's taking, I mean, in some ways, such a big risk being a part of this new, like this brand new model, this brand new league that's launching very early on into a game's life cycle. So I think for us and for everyone inside the league, I don't think anybody was like, oh, well, I shouldn't have to pay as much as this other person because my market has 100,000 fewer people in it. No, it was more like, look, like, we're all in this together, and if it succeeds, it's because we all help it succeed, and if it fails, it's because we don't do a good enough job altogether to help it succeed. And, the benefits of that league's success in the first 2 to 3 years are going to be pretty proportional to each team, right? Like, I don't think, just to note, right, like, if you look at the highest social media followings in the league, like, I don't think Dallas Fuel has a ton of social media followers because Dallas is a huge market. I think they have a bunch of social media followers because they have players and they have a brand and they have content, right? Like, Houston Outlaws is a great team. They do an amazing job on the content and the players, but like, there's probably, like, their success and their popularity is probably more linked to what their team looks like and the way that they create content around it rather than them being the Houston team.
Well, when you're in this position, though, where we're talking about, like, success, obviously in the Overwatch League, it's all relative currently to how long it's been around and expectations. Like, you have to frame it that way.
Of course.
But one of the things I find, I guess, a little bit strange is that a lot of people take this early good news and signs where it's overachieved, perhaps even, or exceeded expectations. And some people seem to almost imply that, like, it's a success already. Like, the Overwatch League has succeeded. Now, for me, it's still very early days, and especially because I remember, here's the thing, if it was the LCS, then yeah, this would be like just season 1 of the LCS. But for me, I feel like the Overwatch League really begins when all those grand plans of we're going to go to different cities and everyone's going to have real geolocation. I mean, this is an inherent part of the model. This is the idea, again, scalability. It's the idea that we're not just going to be successful in one city with Elite. It's going to be a worldwide thing. And however the logistics are to be managed, to me, the biggest challenge is not really begun yet. So
100% agree.
What do you think on... what do you think on that aspect? Like, do you feel as though people can have confidence that, I don't know, some sort of momentum is built from this initial success and the initial markers all look good, and therefore we should feel as though all of that will just unfold perfectly okay? Are there still some massive things you think probably have to be completely figured out? Because I've noticed in a lot of these scenarios, from knowing people who are behind leagues, etc., you have to present publicly that you always have a vision, but there's a big difference between having the vision and knowing the specific step you're going to take at every point, you know?
So look, you're 100% right. Like our chairman, Peter Levin, says that we're in the first inning of the 9-inning game. He's 100% correct. There's many more trials and tribulations and challenges up ahead to make the Overwatch League a kind of permanent generational success. The most significant of which is the move to local markets. Like, that's going to be a massive challenge that everyone needs to be really on their game to execute on well. I think the analogy I would use is like a hurdle race, right? Where like you see 10 hurdles and then the runners have to get over all of them, and like the runner on the first one clears it by like 5 feet, right? Like, that's probably a good sign that things are going well, but that is not a guarantee that they are going to be doing as well later on into the race. Sure. So from my perspective, Blizzard has absolutely over-delivered on viewership, on fan engagement, on local fan affinity, on commercialization, on sponsorship. Pretty much every metric that they could deliver on in Season 1 has been delivered on and over-delivered on. That's a great signal for the future of the league. Does that guarantee success for the future of the league? Absolutely not. There is still risk involved. There are still things that teams need to execute well on in their home markets, and nobody should get complacent just because Season 1 is great, right? But at the same time, Season 1 is great. Like, it's easy to forget how young this league is. This league is less than 6 months old, and they have achieved something this big this quickly. That gives me a lot of confidence in what they can achieve over a longer period of time. It's certainly not a guarantee, but it gives me confidence that the likelihood is higher than not that it will be successful.
Right. One part I wanted to get your take on, because you can also speak to a more abstract concept of how you get investors involved and what kind of expectations you're supposed to set for them, is when the Overwatch League launched. Right, this is another area where you notice some of this isn't things that you've said, and I'm not like calling you out. It's things that like I'm just confused by how so many people, sometimes fans, but sometimes industry people, are fine sort of holding two positions in their mind that seem to be to some degree mutually exclusive. So I'll give you one, okay, which is when the Overwatch League launched and it had these great numbers for the first week and the first play days, and it was looking really awesome, and it did exceed what the worst naysayers probably said. People thought it'd launch with 10k viewers or something ridiculous. When it launched like this is where I feel like some people slipped up, because some people who were invested in the success of the Overwatch League or who just thought it would succeed were like, see, it's doing amazingly, all the naysayers were wrong. But then obviously when the numbers went back down to what now has become the reasonable, seemingly sustainable number for the moment, which is lower, then they were sort of like, yeah, but it was never about the numbers. The numbers are fine, and those numbers are great anyway. It's like, well, come on, guys, which one is it? Was the 400k amazing and proof of success, or is 100k fine? Because we're now being told that, some people have even suggested, only ever needed to have 50,000 viewers, and that was fine for the launch, which, listen, maybe is plausible. So what I want to ask is, first of all, maybe thoughts on the actual Overwatch League viewership and what you think of that. But then as a more abstract concept, when you come to trying to get people to invest millions to be part of a project like this, to some degree, you want to pitch them the success. So how realistic do you have to be with numbers like that? Because obviously they're going to see that number, and, you can give them any explanation you want. 50k is 50k and 100k is 100k. So do you have to sell people on the idea that it's going to go up, or it has to grow in some multiplier factor? What would you say to this topic?
Yeah, well, I mean, to try to answer both your questions, luckily I'm immune here from accusations of hypocrisy, because before the Overwatch League launched, I went on the record saying I think it will have, I would be happy if it had 30 to 40,000 viewers concurrent on average Season 1.
Okay.
right? That's on the record. That was in a public interview, like no dodging that question. So whether it had 5,000 in week 1 or 5 million in week 1, I had gone on the record with like a clear statement about that.
Sure.
From my side, of course, given that I was going to be happy with 30 or 40,000, I was like insanely happy with 400,000 for day 1, even though I knew that was not necessarily going to be sustainable. And I'm still very happy with the 90 to 150,000 that it gets now. That's well above my expectations, and I think it provides a very solid base for us to grow from. I also would like to avoid any revisionist history, right? Like the worst naysayers, like nobody expected it to have viewership this high. Nobody, not people that were in the league. Yeah, not people that were in the league, not people that were like enthusiastic about the league, not fans of the league, not even like most people at Activision Blizzard. Nobody thought it would be even in the range that it's at now on a consistent basis. So I don't think anybody was super disappointed when like, wow, of course, day 1 it has 400,000. Why doesn't it have 400,000 at day 90? I don't think anybody's thinking that way. In terms of how we talk to investors, we knew coming into Overwatch League that it was going to be a long-term growth process to build a franchise around this game, and we were very transparent with our investors about this, right? We said, look, this is a new game. It has not really had much of a structured competitive ecosystem before. The game IP is really good, right? Lots of players, lots of fans of the game, but we have to, it's a little unknown how well that's going to translate over onto the esports side. And so, I was conservative with my viewership expectations, and I was clear, like, look, this is the level I think it needs to be at, 30 or 40,000 concurrent viewers, not to like blow away commercial expectations in year 1, but to set a good foundation for then growing, right? So if it had 30 to 40,000 viewers year 1, I would like to have seen 60 or 80,000 for year 2, and then 80 or 100,000 for year 3. Now that it's blown away my expectations so much in year 1, of course, I still want to see growth, but I also have to kind of recalibrate how exponential that growth will be, right? Like it can't just double every single year, no matter what number it starts off at.
Okay. Right. Call back again to something from the past. People might remember when we did that episode of Esports Salon where it was about the concept of franchising and what.
That was a great episode.
It was a good one, yeah. The pros and cons of it, and obviously I purposely, as I always try to, put together a panel of people where it's definitely not that, like I'm not trying to make it like WWE. They don't have to have the opposite opinion. That'd be outrageous, They just have to have different opinions and different perspectives, and ideally that's what it's going to make a great conversation, which is why this was a good episode, as you mentioned, because obviously Jack was a lot more hardline on the idea almost of like, I just want to succeed, have the best players, and after the fact I'll market them and I'll build their brand up and these sorts of things, whereas you were at the time adamant on the angle of like, well, marketability is actually, it's either there's a balance or in some ways you could see a way in which it would be like, the problem with how you phrase this is nobody as a team owner can ever say I'm fine being in 4th place or whatever, but the implication was, you thought that being able to make money off the team as well as one of the biggest aspects, as opposed to just, I'll go the other way on that one to give the opposite to counterbalance. So obviously it doesn't make any sense to be number 1 and have no fans and no engagement and not get sponsorship. Like that doesn't work either. So there's clearly a middle ground at some point here. Now, if we look at the Overwatch League, fair play to Jack. He's lived up to his words. He not only went and got a team of Koreans, he got 2 teams of Koreans, and he really did. He loaded the deck to be all Korean and go all out on basically what he implied there. So the question is this. Yes, certainly you have some very good Western players in the LA Valiant, and the core obviously came from a team that was considered a Western team, the team that you had in Immortals. But there's a few Koreans in there, and bearing in mind there's a team in the league called the Houston Outlaws, who at least at one point in time was having a decent amount of success with only Western players. Mm-hmm. Why tying back to that? Why don't you have a team like the Outlaws where it's just all the great Western hopes and the big names and hey, the marketable people, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, again, like I think it's not an unfair question, but there's a little bit
unfair because obviously you have to make your choices on what the options are. But just as a bigger philosophy point, though, why haven't you been as strict to that in that sense?
Because I don't think it's a binary solution there, right? Like I don't think it's either go all Korean or go no Korean, right? And I also don't think that like we're a Korean team by any means, right? We have a total of 4 Korean players out of 12 players on our team. That's a lower percentage than any LCS team has, or most LCS teams have, I guess, that have 2 Korean players. We're a team that communicates in English. We're a team that is aiming its content for Western fans. We're a team that's focused on building a fan base in Southern California. And, especially with the Korean population in Los Angeles, there's certainly an argument to be made for why having some Korean player representation on your squad can be important. I guess to answer your question, like, everything's kind of in shades of gray, right? Like, I have to balance, do I sign the best player? Do I sign the most marketable player, right? What does that do for me in the long term? I feel like we're at a very balanced point, right? We, of course, have Korean players on our team. Our Korean players have great personalities, and many fans love them. We also have amazing Western players on our team, whether those are from, the United States or from Canada or from Europe or from Australia. We have a lot of players on our team from all over the world. I think the determining factor is going to be not in looking at what does your Twitter follower count look like, right? Because I think, I don't think anyone would argue that, like, you don't get Twitter followers when you win, right? Like, New York XL, amazing team. Like, love those guys. Like, really marketable, great personalities. Obviously, they're winning. Like, they're doing everything great. I'm huge fans of what they're doing. I'm huge fans of what London Spitfire is doing. But the real question is going to be, in year 3, how are you going to sell 2,500 to 4,000 tickets a night, 20 to 25 times a year, right? And that is not an easy thing to do. So what we are focused on is not like, how do we get an extra 10,000 Twitter followers, or like, how do we be in 3rd place instead of 4th place? We are focused on how to build a real connection to the community that lives in Southern California. Whether those are people that already play Overwatch, or whether they're LA sports fans that don't know what Overwatch is, like, we those are the people that we need to be focused on. Like, I love our fans that are in France, and our fans that are in Australia, and our fans that are in Canada and on the East Coast, right? But at the end of the day, the model of Overwatch League requires me to prioritize and emphasize my local market. And it's good. It should require me to do that for this model to work. So I'm not looking at 6 months into the league, who has won? Who is the winner of Overwatch League, right? I don't know that that's been decided yet, right? Like, NYXL is doing a great job, amazing content, great personalities, lots of winning, good for them. But, like, I'm still focused on something bigger than what's our win and loss record, and how many Twitter followers do our players have, and how many views does our YouTube content get. That's not to say that those things aren't important, and I think we've been doing a pretty good job around that. We're one of the most successful Western teams alongside Boston and Houston and Philadelphia. We're one of the few teams that I think has been able to hold our own against the Korean teams, depending on the day of the week we play them on. And I think we are really well set up for long-term competitive growth, given, again, like, I think we're still the youngest average team in Overwatch League, which is pretty incredible. And so I'm really excited to see where the future goes, not just from a fan base perspective, but from a competitive perspective with these guys. Again, I've started to end up kind of talking around your question rather than directly answering your question, but hopefully that provides a pretty good summary.
I'm more than familiar with that approach, and that is part of the game. So I accept that going in. So, okay, here's a question I have. That was part 2 of my interview with Noah Whinston. Part 1 was about League of Legends, if you missed that. And part 3, which is forthcoming, will be about the CSGO team and the infamous scenario where they had to release some of the players and eventually sold the team to 100 Thieves. This video was made possible by Dean Tanglis, Sanity, Gman, Andreas, Snazore, Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Jerky's Minion, Anthony, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Travis T. Greb. Just like my man, a lot of people think you can't tell me nothing. But I've graduated from that mindset, and now it is possible to have influence over some of the people I have on my shows, some of the topics I cover, to ask me questions directly and get exclusive teasers for upcoming projects I'm working on. Unlock the code to the streets and join the Scrilluminati today at the Patreon link below.